Well, we're here. See, we remembered this week to press the record button. So we'll begin our study today. The lessons for this coming Sunday, which are the lessons designated in the lectionary for the Sunday designated Proper 8, which for us in using track 2, we'll look at the wisdom of Solomon as the first lesson, 2 Corinthians 8:7 and following as the second lesson, and Mark 5:21 to 43. And that's where I'd like to go directly. Given our pre-study conversation, I think this particular gospel passage is exceedingly helpful in many, many ways. So let's go there. Let's do the screen share. And so we are looking at Mark 5, verses 21 to 43. Now, just a couple of technical things here. When we read this passage, we'll see something that is somewhat unique to Mark's style of writing and composition. We're actually going to see two stories, and one that is sandwiched, one of them is sandwiched in the middle. So we start a story, we have another story, and then we go back to the first story. So just to avoid any kind of confusion, we are dealing with two separate stories. But what that does in Mark's composition style says that these two stories are related. So these two stories about Jesus' ministry are related to each other. Now, there's going to be an obvious relation relative because these are healing stories. But healing stories could be simply put in series, so that means that we're going to try to dig a little deeper and a little more into what that relationship might be. But first, let's just read the story. When Mark had crossed again in the boat, when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, came, and when he saw him, he fell at his feet and begged him, meaning Jesus, repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come, lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him. And a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. This is the start of the second story. She had endured much under the many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, for she said, if I touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately, her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware of that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it, but the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. But then he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." Now, while he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." And so then he allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And when they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping. And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside. He took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, Talita kum, which simply means, little girl, get up. And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was about 12 years of age. And at this, they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. Okay, here's the opening question as always. What strikes you?
Both women
Ah, okay.
who are of basically no account, and
One was a child.
yeah, and the other had no means of, if she was a widow or something, she had no means of support, and she was unclean. She couldn't go into the temple. She couldn't. There was no way for her to make a living for herself except begging.
Mhm.
There is a difference in who was petitioning for the help. One was the father and one was the woman herself who was brave enough to feel and had faith enough to feel that she could do this
Mhm.
by touching.
Mhm. Mhm.
Both cases, Jesus is violating
Ah,
rules of purity.
Oh yeah, you never touch the dead.
yes. He's touching a bleeding woman. Well, actually, he didn't touch her. She touched him. And a dead person. Both proscriptions of the law relative to ritual purity. Anything else? Well, let's dig into that a little bit because actually you hit probably the main themes. But I think to make them really stick, we want to talk about that a little bit. Let's talk about the hemorrhaging woman for a moment. Because that's the one story that's all compact. It's in one sort of telling. Carmen mentioned about the whole ritual impurity thing. This was very big stuff. To us, it might seem, not of any consequence. But this idea of becoming ritually unclean, we've talked about this before when we've talked about baptism, that once you became quote unquote unclean, even accidentally, then you had to go through a whole series of things to be purified. The whole ritual bath, the mikvah, that whole thing. And it wasn't a simple thing. I mean, it took time and it took energy. So people avoided impurity at all costs. So a woman like this would not only have been seen as at the margins a bit because she had a constant hemorrhage, so she was constantly unclean. She had a chronic illness, so she was chronically impure. Think about that. Chronically impure. Not only cannot go. I mean, when it's cold and flu season, we tell people don't come to church, stay home, don't infect other people. But that goes away. And it's not that we're going to, push you into some sort of corner if you cough or something in church. That's not the point. But the idea is that, social responsibility makes it that way. Social responsibility in this era would have been that she would not get near anybody.
Well,
If
and
she was,
she wouldn't just be an outsider to the community, her family would put her out. I
There you
mean,
go. I
it's
mean,
like,
she couldn't be more marginalized than this. That she actually was, even in her own, if she had any sense of social responsibility, which, most people did for the community,
mhm.
that she would isolate herself. I mean, that's why lepers went into leper colonies and so on, was because they not only didn't want to infect people, but they didn't want to make other people unclean. At the Pride service, the gospel lesson was the story of the Good Samaritan. That's one of the ways of understanding why the Levite and why the priest walked on by, was because they saw a bleeding man at the side of the road and they were on their way to temple. So they put the strictures of the law, and that's what Jesus is saying in that particular pericope. He's saying they put the strictures and the requirements of the law over compassion. And the Samaritan had no such qualms. And so he's the one who is really neighbor because he puts compassion over all else. So that's why, when I opened this sermon last week, I said Jesus was a revolutionary. Now, he wasn't trying to uphold the social order. He was trying to reform it from the inside out. And what happens here is that he's not aware of any of this. Notice what she does. Mark makes it very clear. She pushed her way through the crowd. She took her life into her hands by doing that, because anybody she touched in sort of like pushing people away, I need to get close to him, get out of my way, he's moving and I gotta, I don't move so quickly because I'm weak. And I'll, think about the actual existential situation of this woman. And she is struggling through a crowd. And she's placing herself in harm's way because anybody who knows her situation is going to say, get out of here, you person.
In both cases, it's the touching. She touches Jesus' robes. He touches the little girl.
You're
There
going to
is
get, yeah.
physical contact.
Yes, that put a pin in that, Judith. We're going to come back to it because it's very important.
Okay. Put a pin
So
in.
that when we are in this situation, and she is touching a lot of people, she's not just touching Jesus. It's not like she just ran up to Jesus and grabbed the hem of his garment. She's in this crowd. He doesn't even know she's there. But interesting, Mark says she felt the power go out of him. I think that I don't know quite what that means. I'm still plumbing that myself. What does that mean? This power. And it goes back to, we had a discussion about this some time ago about exousia in Greek, the authority out of the substance of one's being. So somehow this power is innate in Jesus, and he feels drained by this. George, when you perform surgeries, you were exhausted when it was over with, I'm sure.
Depending on what I was doing, but there were plenty of times when we didn't know how it was going to go. And sometimes you say a few prayers in the operating room.
Yeah, and just the standing there and the concentration and the use of skill and all of that, it just takes some out of it. On Sunday mornings, in this group, Carmen is the only one who would have had this experience. People just think, oh well, it's Sunday morning, you preach. Mike Henn is like, well, how did it go? I was fine. I said, I'm exhausted. Well, he'll just joke because he knows better. Well, all you did was talk.
Yeah.
And you do that really easily. He'll make fun of me and stuff. And of course, he's saying he doesn't come to church very often to listen to me preach because he gets a sermon every day. Those kinds of comments. But the idea that to do anything with any sense of authority, you have to dig down deep. And so in healing, in his healing ministry, Jesus is digging down deep. It isn't just pro forma ritual. So there's that piece of it. And notice she doesn't try to touch him. She says, all I need is to touch the hem of his garment, not just like grab onto his cloak, but just the edge of it will be enough for me. I mean, think of the faith and confidence and trust that this woman had in this person, Jesus, that all she needed to do was touch the very edge of his existence, of his physical existence, the hem of his garment. Didn't even need to embrace him. He didn't even need to impose hands on her. He didn't need to do any of those things. But her faith was just get me close enough that I can just swipe my hand against the hem of his garment. Which then turns it around in the sense of, Judith, your other point about touch, which is important here, as I mentioned, but it isn't Jesus touching. It's simply the contact, the making of contact. Regardless of on whose initiative this took place. In the story of Jairus' daughter, it's Jesus' initiative. He reaches down and takes her hand. In the story of the woman with the hemorrhage, it's her initiative. She goes to Jesus.
Well, and the way Mark is always driving stories forward, immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and immediately Jesus was aware that power went out of him.
Another good point. You're listening.
This connection was immediately felt by both parties.
Yes. That there's this urgency always in Mark. You're right. The sense of urgency in Mark is that Jesus has something to do. And when Jesus does it, it gets done. If it's done in the authority of Jesus, it gets done. And the result is, as you've mentioned, immediate. Now, that might be run contrary to our common experience, because we can pray and 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 pray, and it seems nothing is happening. But I had this conversation with someone in my office yesterday who's going through a very difficult time. And I said, God is working whether we see it or not. And sometimes God is even using negative circumstances to do God's work, even pain and suffering. And we talked a little bit about meditating on the cross and that sort of thing. But the notion that God is simply this sort of, I often refer to that idea of Santa Claus in the sky, that he just gives us good gifts here and there, that sort of thing. And I brought forward, in this conversation, the line from scripture when Jesus talks about, I think it's in Matthew, where he says about prayer, he says, pray to your heavenly Father, he will give you nothing that will hurt you. I mean, in a sense, it will bring you permanent harm. So, I mean, because he says, what father, when a child asks for a fish, would give him a snake, or an egg and give him a scorpion? So whatever we ask of God, and if God is answering our prayers, we can be assured that even if we are suffering in the middle of something, that what God will do for us will ultimately bring good. But suffering itself is not in and of itself an evil. So that's where we make a mistake. Suffering itself is not necessarily an evil. When I was a musician and practicing of all things, the trumpet, I mean, it's why I don't play it very much anymore, as most people can't stand it when I'm practicing. It's painful to my housemates, no matter where, who, what, when. But also, in terms of the practicing, I mean, it's hours of physical exertion. If you're a pianist, it's the same thing. I mean, you have to spend hours doing etudes and scales and things to make your fingers work the way they're supposed to, totally independently. A voice major, hours and hours of scales up and down. Kathy, you take lessons from Gwendolyn, that stuff's not easy to do. And then you talk about athletics. I mean, that's the most obvious one. I mean, to train for the event, you can't just do it the night before. It's a lifelong pattern of behavior that has to occur. High-level professional athletes are constantly in training, even in the quote-unquote off season. So that when we see this, we begin to understand that the suffering that these people are enduring is for a greater good. So the woman has been sick all these many years, 11, 12 years, whatever, 12 years. Imagine the anemia that she was, experiencing.
And that's interesting too. She's been sick for 12 years, as long as the little girl's been alive. She's 12 years old.
Yeah.
Never noticed that before.
Yeah, this is interesting. It just came to mind. I heard this sermon preached on this passage at Westminster Abbey last year. This was a Sunday. This particular set of readings was what was used at the Abbey last year. I don't know why would have been. Well, they're in a different cycle than we are, but anyway, and this was one of the things that particular point to this was one of the things that the preacher brought forward, that the woman had been ill as long as the girl had been alive. And I won't go in, I don't want to preach the sermon that he preached, but it's just an interesting point, so we can ask ourselves, what does this mean? But we get the meaning when we look at the outcomes.
Mhm.
Jesus restores the woman, and it is by her faith. Now, this woman, as we said, for 12 long years has been totally isolated, totally put aside, totally separated from not only her synagogue community, but also, as also has been mentioned, her family, and so on. She has little in terms of real human relationships. And the fact that this has been going on for 12 years just makes that absolutely clear. This woman is alone. This woman is alone. She is suffering from not only the physical debilitating, I just mentioned anemia and so on, all the things that would happen for someone who had a chronic hemorrhage for 12 years. There'd be all kinds of pain associated with that. I mean, apart from the bleeding and so on. And she'd been going through this. She's so desperate that she no longer cares about social isolation or, making someone else impure or unclean. She's just going to go to the source. And regardless of what he's doing, she interrupts him. So it's like, hello, Jesus, knock on the door. I know you're busy, but here I am. And interestingly, even though her status is one of isolation and marginalization, she is unclean relative to the larger religious community, her family, and so on. How does Jesus address her?
Sister.
Daughter. But you're right, it's a familial address.
Yeah.
It's one of intimacy. So what the message that's implicit here is that not only is Jesus taking care of her physical ailment, but Jesus is restoring her to a level of social intimacy and giving her a new title. daughter. Daughter. Think about that. This is a woman who's been alone for 12 years. And Jesus calls her daughter. Who was the last person who called her daughter? Probably her physical father, who would either is not on the scene because this is an older woman. Well, we don't really know how old she is, but in the sense that she's mature, but also because of her hemorrhaging and so on, would not have had contact with her family. She'd been like a leper, but it wasn't even like a leper colony. You have fellow lepers with you. So she's totally socially isolated. And Jesus, once the healing occurs, turns to her and says, daughter, imagine the impact that would have. Now, as an aside, given our pre-study conversation, isn't that the role of the church? When people are pushed to the margins and they're told they don't belong because of their quote unquote status, their quote unquote sin, their uncleanness, their unrighteousness, whatever. Isn't it the church's role to reach out and restore that intimacy? The issue in our current situation is about sexual identity, gender identity, all these kinds of things. But those are the people that are feeling the most alienation currently from a social class.
It's also the homeless, people who are like race isolation.
Mhm.
There are too many causes of isolation in our world.
Well, and that was one of the responses in our social media over this whole thing about the Pride service was, do you see what else we do? Somehow people get in their head, this is all we do. We don't have a sort of homeless Pride Day, in that sense, or, anything like that. But we are constantly and chronically involved in dealing with matters of social isolation in terms of meeting people who are hungry, meeting people who are homeless. In fact, I sort of quoted back to one of the posters, have you read Matthew 25 lately? I didn't quite say it that way, but that was the implication of what I was reading, which is where Jesus, it's the parable of the sheep and the goats. When you have done it for the least of these, you have done it to me. And they're just hell-bent on focus and, sexual ethics is the whole of ethics, Christian ethics somehow. That's where our society is gone. And so that's a hot button issue. But if we were having a festival to overcome homelessness or economic instability or any of those, people would barely take notice. They just say, oh, those liberals, they're trying to take my tax dollars and do these kinds of things, but social policy around those things is part of what the kingdom of God is about.
Well, it's because we've decided that they're unclean.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Right. See, and how do we do that? Well, that's when we do, well, I remember preaching a sermon. I've preached it in every parish that I've ever been in my entire life. They get this at least once. And I know the day that I did this at St. Luke's, it was several years ago, I got a lot of pushback. Again, because, we have a lot of politically conservative folk. They may be open, in terms of the present issue, but I said something about privilege and about, I said something to the effect, since when is it a privilege to eat? Since when it is a privilege to have clothing? Since when it is a privilege to have a safe place to lay your head? Because we talk about, we have this funny term we use, and it's sort of an oxymoron in some ways, the underprivileged, the poor, the homeless, the hungry. We call them underprivileged. No, they're not underprivileged. These are matters of social justice.
Mhm.
And that's the clear message of the prophets. There's no two ways about it. It's not a matter of privilege. I'm not privileged to have enough to eat. Well, I am. I mean, in the sense that I thank God for the resources that I've been given and so on, but I know where they come from. And once I've been taken care of, then I need to take what excess I have and share it with those who do not have. That's the message of Acts 2. I mean, it's all over the place. But then I got a lot of pushback, and here's where the social bias comes out. They're that way because they're lazy. They're that way because of the welfare state. They're that way because, without really addressing the core issue of what are the systemic problems that cause poverty? What are the systemic problems that cause homelessness? Yes, some people are going to take advantage of the system, but that's on them, not on us. Judith, you wanted to say something.
Well, and that's where people tend to be judgmental in looking at the people on the fringes of society or whatever as the deserving and the undeserving poor.
Ah, there you go.
Some people deserve help and some don't deserve help. And I have trouble wrapping my head around that.
I said in a sermon 2 weeks ago, I said the Protestant work ethic is a heresy.
Oh.
And I saw a lot of eyes go, what? Well, it is.
I want to go
Because
back.
We
particularly
can
if we're-
understand why you get in trouble so many
Yeah.
times.
well, but it is when you think about the whole concept of the Reformed tradition with the whole notion of grace. We don't earn grace.
Nope. Nope.
Why? And we don't earn justice. Justice is a demand that we can make on God and on God's people. So that's that sermon that I was getting in trouble for, was that the acts that we do relative to taking care of the homeless, the hungry, the marginalized, these are not acts of charity. These are acts of justice. And then I kind of do a little teaching that before you can get to the point where you can say charity, you can say love, you must do justice first. That same writing that I mentioned earlier on today about the teaching of Paul VI, he said it this way in the same encyclical. If you want peace, strive for justice. If you want shalom, if you want wholeness, then you must work for justice in the world. You must create a just social order. Only then will you find peace. Most people in our culture define peace as a lack of violence or a lack of discord. No, the biblical notion of peace is the beloved community that we're constantly talking about. It's where we are actually acting justly toward one another. And the stuff of justice, it's a justice issue when you can say, I demand it. It is my right. Rights is the language of justice. And that's when I ask the question, is it a privilege to eat or is it a right to eat, to have enough food? Is it a privilege to have a safe place to sleep at night where I am not threatened and I am not vulnerable? Or is it a right to have that? Now, again, in terms of our political constructs, there are no such rights. They're not in the Constitution, blah, 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 blah. Well, no, there are things called human rights. And those are a relatively recent phenomenon and development in human knowledge. And they emerged from the Second World War because we saw the heinousness of human action when those fundamental rights, those fundamental human rights, were taken away from people. And so the Declaration on Human Rights of 1948 of the United Nations, that emerged out of the experience of the Second World War. A lot of people think, well, it was fascism and, democracy. Well, that was it.
Okay.
But the real cause of it was this severe and depraved deprivation of human rights. Kathy.
Can I make a plug for a book?
Sure.
This is a book, You Shall Not Bow Down and Serve Them.
Mhm.
It's a book I'm using in a class that I'm taking right now. Fantastic book on social justice.
Who's it by? Richard Hemsley?
Horsley.
Horsley. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, it's starting to sound a lot like a liberation theologist. I hate to tell you that.
Well, Walter Brueggemann, who you've heard me quote very frequently relative to our study when we study the prophets, he said this. His fundamental view of the prophets of the Old Testament is a constant hearkening back to Pharaoh.
And just this of and God's action was not he's not releasing them for religious reasons. He was releasing them for economic justice reasons.
Yes. That
And
we have pharaohs in our day. And his whole social critique relative using the Old Testament, he's an Old Testament scholar, using the prophets, he has a whole theology built around this notion that we essentially serve modern pharaohs, whether they are, economic gain or, social media or you name it, in other words, we're setting up false gods, because that was Pharaoh's breaking point, was he saw himself as God. And it's the God Yahweh, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, who says, no, I am the Lord God. There you shall have no other gods but me. And when we serve any other God, we are essentially violating that first commandment. And most people say, well, I don't set up idols in my house. Oh, yes, you do.
we all do, whether we think about it or not. We all have moments where we put something else above God.
Yes. And it isn't about if I go to church on Sunday and all that sort of thing. It is about where my values are oriented.
Mhm.
And so this discussion about justice and charity and how they relate to each other goes back to that fundamental command.
And that's probably the issue that causes more trouble. It's easier to see acts of mercy as acceptable. I give someone a plate of food. I pay for someone's well-being, or I treat someone decently, one way or the other. I contribute. And if it's a personal thing, it's easy to accept. The problem is when we get to the systemic part, to the cause of the trouble.
Mhm.
That's when what is difficult generally. At one point, I was doing some presentation to a group of Methodist leaders, and we were talking about acts of mercy and acts of justice. And I used an example that caused a lot of discussion and trouble. I used the example of something that I saw in Brazil. In front of a church, they have marked the bodies of children that used to sleep in front of that church. And one night, a group of people who felt like these kids were robbers and undeserving poor, killed them
Oh my.
while they were sleeping. And the church and the people in the community, in order to remember that crime, mark the little bodies in front of the church. So you go in front of this church and you see these little bodies, forms and at the entrance. It's a remembrance of these
Mhm.
children that grew up probably in houses that could not afford having them, and learn how to rob, learn how to be smart kids by getting into all kinds of crimes. But it was, for me, it was an example of the dilemma. Because yes, these kids needed some help individually. They were socially not acceptable in some ways. And yet, on the other hand, we have to consider what were the costs. Why were they in this condition? What is happening in the families that created and threw away their own children to the streets? And so both things are important.
Showing outlines of bodies like that also is a very strong reminder of the crime, not what you were specifically talking about, but the crime of their elimination. Because what do the police do at crime scenes frequently is outline the body in the position that it fell. So it speaks in many ways to have that.
I have not been there yet, but this is also the theory and the understanding behind the memorial, the slavery memorial. I think it's in Alabama or Mississippi, one of the deep South states, where there are these hanging objects. Judith, you're the artist, you would know more about this than I, but they're just sort of metal casements, and that's to recall the lynchings, actually.
Yes, and there is a song about that. Something about fruit. I can't think of the name of it, but it's about the bodies hanging from the trees.
Mm-hmm. And and part of the project became, it was just sort of a afterthought, but it became a central part of the project, that people now bring jars full of soil where actual lynchings took place, and they bring them to this memorial, and they're stored there, where, again, to make sure we understand that this was real. It's like the Holocaust. There's no more, if you've never been, it's a bucket list kind of thing. The Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. I went twice. Both times I had a very difficult time making it through. Not because it's big, I mean, it's long, but it's also just emotionally just draining. I mean, the first time I went, I was in tears, because one of the things they make you do, I mean, they'll make you do it, but I mean, it's part of the tour,
Courage.
is to go into, they have one of the actual rail cars that transported the people to the death camps. You actually walk into it and then outside of it. Another way of doing it, like the soil in the jars, was they have just piles of shoes that were recovered from the camps. And you see, when you look at it carefully, it's a pile of shoes, of course, but you see children's shoes, and you see old people's shoes in there. Again, this was a violation of human nature. And so that's why the human rights movement emerged from that.
With the Holocaust, I would like to go, and I know I will be in tears from the minute I step into the building. I know that. Are you familiar with the children's book about 1,000,000 paper clips?
No.
Hang on a sec.
Okay.
If I can find it.
The artist teacher in us here is
teaching about the Holocaust. And a teacher was teaching children about the Holocaust and talked about the millions of people that died. But the kids could not figure out, well, what does 1,000,000 look like? So they started collecting paper clips. So I can't lay my hands on it right now, but I have this book. And they put out sort of a message out among the community, and then it went nationwide, then it went worldwide, and people were sending paper clips. These kids at this school. They wanted to make a permanent display or a memorial, so they decided to get one of the box cars from Germany. Most of them were destroyed after the war, and they had to hunt high and low. Finally found one, I forget which country, the Netherlands or Belgium maybe, and whoever owned it was willing to sell it. And they raised the money to buy it, took it back to this town, and filled it with paper clips. And they had paper clips left over, so they added on to the memorial, but it was to give a physical sign of this is how many people died because of a certain ideology that just, pervaded a time that we need to remember.
Well, and these things are not only in the past.
They're continuing,
We were talking about this idea of touch. It's come around to that.
Yep.
And the important role that played in Judaism, because in Judaism, touching, the laying on of hands, was a sign of many, many different things. You can go into the Old Testament and you see this is how authority was passed from one person to the next. We call it ordination.
I was going to say.
It was the way healings actually occurred. Was, as we see in this particular narrative, that Jesus employs the laying on of hands, particularly with Jairus' daughter. You mentioned the touch of the hem of the garment. Again, there's the connection. This is the important thing I was getting at about the social media thing and loneliness and so on, is the importance of social intimacy. That, we must be able to have that kind of intimacy, person to person, to the point where we may not physically touch someone, but we need to touch someone. Advertising talks about it this way. For example, one of the rules of thumb in effective advertising, in order to get your message across, it must be the same message in the same media to touch people 7 times. That's how you get across. You bring, it's called top of mind. Bring something to top of mind. So the idea of an emotional or an intellectual touch, as well as this physical touch. When we do healing on the Wednesday service, we have the laying on of hands. It's part of the healing ritual. So that these things become extremely important. COVID kind of pushed us away from it for good reason, but we also felt the lack. If I heard it once, I heard it 100 times. I don't like the fact that we can't come to church because I can't see my people. Can see each other on Zoom, or we can, do online worship and all this stuff. It is not as effective as actually being physically and morally present to one another. So Jesus makes this very clear in these 2 stories, that the ones who have been totally marginalized because of their status, one because of a chronic hemorrhage, the other because of death, in order to restore them to wholeness, to shalom, to peace, they need to be touched. There needs to be that social intimacy as part of it. Go back in your collective memories here. We're all old enough to remember this. That I think it was the 1980s, when Romania, the communist regime of Ceausescu fell in Romania, they found these orphanages. Because of some strange social policies that his regime imposed on the people of Romania. There were these children who were, just as Carmen sort of outlined with the children in front of the church, were not wanted. or were not permitted into the normal course of society. So they were raised in these orphanages, and they were terribly underfunded, and they were terribly understaffed, to the point where young infants, except by being changed from their, relieving themselves and bathed, were not held. They were not touched. They were not coddled.
Mhm.
And they grew into toddlers and into young children without that sense. And the psychological damage that they discovered within these people, these young people, was telling. That they grew, the way that the writer said it this way, they grew into human creatures, but they did not grow into human persons,
Mhm.
Yeah.
because they lacked the sense of social intimacy that just comes from the nuclear family, of being held, or beloved. You're not feeling well, somebody holds your hand, those kinds of things.
Yep.
And I can say, as a pastor, probably some of the most intimate and meaningful moments of my years of ministry is to be with someone who is dying and to hold their hand. The comfort that that gives is palpable. You can see it. And particularly if the person is even just a tad bit aware and can respond, you can see it in their eyes, or in the way that they respond by holding your hand in reverse. And even those who are breathing their last, I've been able to just, put my hand on their hand, or their hand on their shoulder. And there's just something there. That's that exousia, that power goes out. You feel it. You feel it. And that is so terribly important. One of the prayers that I love when we do the healing service on Wednesday is the last one that says, be with us who minister to the sick and the dying, because though we may appear healthy at any time, we too suffer from our human condition in a fallen world. That part of our ministry with the sick and the dying, and by extension from these passages, those who are at the margins of society, is to touch them, is to hold them, to bring them into oneness with others. So these stories, that's one of the deeper things that connects these two stories. A number of things: women, marginalization, healing, wholeness, restoration. Okay, go ahead.
I have two more. The woman, is like the lowest of the low.
Mm-hmm.
But the father who is asking for help for his daughter is a leader of the synagogue. So you have got the extremes socially, both going to Jesus. And what Jesus says to the woman is, your faith has made you well. When the people come and say, don't bother the teacher, the daughter is dead, Jesus says, do not fear, only believe. So we have another link with belief, with faith, and we have the wide span of the society. This is a
Couple
good
of things,
story.
wonderful. Well, yeah, wonderful things there that you just said. In fact, it was a point I wanted to make, but we were growing short of time, so I didn't make it. But thank you for making it. Now we can expand a couple more minutes to talk about it. This idea of the difference in social status. Notice that when they came to say that she was dead, they didn't talk to Jesus. They talked to Jairus.
Uh-huh.
Don't bother the teacher anymore. So they're clearly not addressing Jesus. Jesus overhears them and
Mm-hmm.
says, do not fret, only believe. So, if we as church are called to do as Jesus did, there's a whole castle full of stuff here.
Yeah.
One is, even if we just simply overhear the problem,
Mm.
we need to go out and address it. If someone comes to us in desperation and doesn't even try to get our attention, just wants a little help, we need to feel the power come out of us in assistance to that person. And it is regardless of social standing or social status. One bit of summary point here. We brought up the notion of idols and the first commandment. And when I sort of made passing reference to the story of the Good Samaritan, which we used at the Pride service last week. The primacy of exercising compassion over ritual demands. Notice in both, which you all pointed out, in both these cases, these people are unclean and impure. But Jesus washes, I don't want to use that term. Jesus pushes that to the side and says, none of that is important if you don't exercise compassion. But that message begins to ring louder and louder and louder throughout the Gospels. That while Jesus even says, I do not come to abolish the law, he says, I come to fulfill it. And that the fulfilling of all of this stuff that we do, ritually and otherwise, is the exercise of compassion. Some call it mercy, some call it loving kindness. It is not charity. It begins in justice, not in injustice, but in justice, and then moves to love. And it is at that level then that we are capable of compassion in the way that Jesus exercised it. But as Paul teaches us as well, the law is a teacher. It is a stern teacher. And so the reason Jesus says, I do not come to abolish the law, was because it's the way we learn. But we cannot make the law an idol. And that's where Paul and Jesus are totally in agreement, of course. And what he was trying to get across. Don't simply dismiss the law, but learn from it, and it will point you toward the higher values. You know, that's what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13. When you then turn that around and you address the situation, we're talking about social media and all the posts and everything about, you know, the Bible says, you know, God said it, I believe it, that ends it. One of the things that I hold against my brothers and sisters in Christ from many different religious communities is to make the Bible itself into an idol, where we worship the Bible and not its author. Because if we make the Bible the idol, that allows us to pick and choose what we will take and not take as, you know, as the word of God and all that sort of thing. But we have to see that it is the entire compendium of all of these teachings, and they all distill down to this fundamental teaching of compassion. All of it. From the get-go, from the story of creation on. That's the one thing where you can talk about it consistently. So that when it says, well, the Bible says you shall not do this, you shall not do that. Okay, but do you want to talk about the context? Do you want to talk about what was being addressed and all this kind of stuff? No. Well, then you turn the words of the Bible into an idol. Because they determine your life and not the God who wrote them. And so these stories make that very clear. Anything else? George, you look like words are about ready to speak.
Well, this is one of our more profound discussions. And because it's about everyday life.
Mhm.
And little things like when you talk to somebody and you touch them while you're talking,
Mhm.
all of a sudden imparts a somewhat different intimacy
Mhm.
of it. And it's a signal that you care.
Yes.
And that's the kind of signal that can we can miss that in our anger.
Yes.
It's the first thing we forget.
But we can also see that touch can be a instrument of violence.
Yeah.
You know,
Well,
when we're angry, we touch somebody, but we punch them. That's
one of the good things about being a surgeon is that I had to touch my patients.
Mm.
And I even talk to my residents about touching your patient because it's a signal that you care.
Mhm.
And I have listened to people who came back from a visit to a doctor, and which was unsatisfactory because the guy never looked at me. He
Mhm.
just looked at his computer
Mhm.
and then gave me a prescription, and that was it. And that's never it. And the uh, it you feel this bond between yourself and the patient when you're doing something where I have to physically touch them and look at them and examine something, and it becomes a part of my almost a ritual when I would be seeing my patients. Uh, and the and I must say that when I get examined, I always notice how the person touches me. And with you, when our Wednesday morning service and you put your hands on me, it's a it's a very powerful force,
Mhm.
and you feel it happening to yourself.
Mhm. Well, and I do want to make this point that it's not only touch, it's going back to Jesus, it's this notion of exousia, this power. When the power, when the power of touch takes something of us and gives it to the person we're touching. Notice how when touch can be violative, however. Why is it violative? Because you're touching the other person to get something for yourself.
Mhm.
And people violate other people through touch. You know, in terms of physicians, you know, we've seen those stories in the Olympic teams and that sort of thing. The whole, you know, clergy sex scandals in various churches. Same is true in education and you know, scouting and all that kind of. When people are touching people or forcing touch for their own self, for their egotistical or ego-centered reasons, it's violative because you're robbing someone of their energy, their power. However, when you are touching with the intent of healing, of reconciling, of making whole again, whatever, you know, but it's coming out of you to the other person, that is not violative. In fact, that exhibits great power. So touch in and of itself is neither good nor bad, or it's both, depending on your perspective. It's about the motivation. So I was using advertising, for example. When you touch somebody's mind 7 times, same media, same message, that message can be very negative. Hence the issue of social media and so on, the big lie that we talk about in politics these days. You just say it. I mean, that's what Hitler did in the Second War, before the Second World War. They understood. You say the lie enough with enough conviction, enough times, enough people repeat it, suddenly it becomes true. And people who count it as true are the people who, with lack of curiosity and all the things we talked about early on, before we began our formal study, that can end up being violative and actually destructive of our social fabric, of our relationships, and all the things that we thought were positive about this particular passage. So it is something that needs to be guarded and something that needs to be stewarded carefully. And hence the whole idea behind stewardship is that we have been given these gifts by God, and we have to use them for God's purposes, not our own. And with that in mind, we did extend it a few minutes here, thanks to Judith.
It's all her fault.
Hey, I've got broad shoulders. I can take it.
Yeah. Well, actually,
There
this
you go.
isn't really, we haven't really extended it that far.
That's true. We got through it. So I would just leave you with that today. And, again, listen with curious ears when we hear this on Sunday during the liturgy. So take care.
I will see you in 2 weeks.
Yes, next week we do not have Bible study because it is the 4th of July. So we're going to take a little hiatus for next week, and then we'll see you the week following.
Well, you won't see me in church either. I'll be camping.
Okay.
We're leaving Saturday morning for the woods.
All right. Well, good luck with this heat and all. So take
Be
care.
careful.
Hey, at 3,500 feet, it's a lot cooler.
Yeah, but
Oh.
it's this heat dome is affecting a lot of people. It normally doesn't. So we'll see.
Yeah, well,
Good luck.
so far the forecast looks like it'll be in the upper 70s to low 80s
Oh, good.
during the daytime, and at night in the 60s.
That's
Oh.
good. That's comfortable.
Yeah.
Where are you hiking?
Well, we go to the Shenandoah National Park.
Okay. Because I have
Skyline
friends who
Drive.
just came back from a couple of
Been
days.
there many times.
Yeah. Well, this is our 39th or 40th year of going down there.
Ah, wonderful.
Bernie actually proposed to me down there.
Oh, that's nice. All right, folks, we're going to end it for now. Take care. We'll see you in 2 weeks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.